11th standard physics unit 1 nature of physical world and measurement la இன்னைக்கு பார்க்க போற டாபிக்ஸ் வந்து definition of physical quantity, number 2 types of physical quantities. இது ரெண்டு தான் இன்னைக்கு பார்க்க போறது. ஃபர்ஸ்ட் வந்து definition of physical quantity அப்படினா என்னன்னு பார்ப்போம். Quantities that can be measured and in terms of which laws of physics are described are called physical quantities. அதாவது quantities that can be measured, quantities வந்து மெஷரபிளாக இருக்கணும். அதுக்கப்புறம் அந்த குவான்டிட்டிஸை வச்சு நம்ம லாஸ் ஆஃப் ஃபிசிக்ஸை வந்து டிஸ்கிரைப் பண்ணுற மாதிரி இருக்கணும். தட் குவான்டிட்டிஸ் ஆர் கால்டு ஃபிசிக்கல் குவான்டிட்டிஸ். ஸோ த குவான்டிட்டிஸ் தட் கேன் பி மெஷர்ட் அண்ட் இன் டேர்ம்ஸ் ஆஃப் விச் த லாஸ் ஆஃப் ஃபிசிக்ஸ் ஆர் டிஸ்கிரைப்ட் ஆர் கால்டு ஃபிசிக்கல் குவான்டிட்டிஸ். ஸோ மெஷரபிளாகவும் இருக்கணும், அதுக்கப்புறம் நம்ம லாஸ் ஆஃப் ஃபிசிக்ஸை வந்து டிஸ்கிரைப் பண்ணுற மாதிரி இருக்கணும். தட் குவான்டிட்டிஸ் ஆர் கால்டு ஃபிசிக்கல் குவான்டிட்டிஸ். எக்ஸாம்பிள் பார்த்தீங்கன்னா லென்த், மாஸ், டைம், force. So these quantities are called physical quantities. Next, types of physical quantities. இப்போ வந்து physical quantitiesல எத்தனை types இருக்குன்னு பார்க்கலாம். Physical quantities are classified into two types. One is fundamental quantity, the second one is derived quantities. These are the two types of physical quantities. The first one is fundamental quantities, the second is the derived quantities. First, இப்போ fundamental quantities என்னன்னு பார்க்கலாம். Fundamental quantities are the quantities which cannot be expressed in terms of any other quantities. Fundamental quantities are also known as base quantities. These base quantities cannot be expressed in terms of any other physical quantities. அதாவது வேற physical quantities வச்சு இந்த quantities எல்லாம் நம்ம எக்ஸ்பிரஸ் பண்ண முடியாது. What are they அப்படின்னு பார்த்தீங்கன்னா there are 7 base quantities are there. The first is length, the second one is mass, the third is time, next is electric current, temperature, luminous intensity, amount of substance. So these are the fundamental quantities. So these base quantities cannot be expressed in terms of any other physical quantities. So there are 7 base quantities are there. Length, mass, time, electric current, temperature, luminous intensity and amount of substance. So these are all the base quantities. Next, இப்போ derived quantitiesனா என்னன்னு பார்க்கலாம். Quantities that can be expressed in terms of fundamental quantities are called derived quantities. இந்த quantities எல்லாமே வந்து fundamental quantities வச்சு நம்ம எக்ஸ்பிரஸ் பண்ணிக்கலாம், derive பண்ணிக்கலாம். Okay, these quantities are called derived quantities. That is why it is called as derived quantities. We are deriving the quantities, we are expressing the quantities in terms of the base quantities. Those physical quantities are called derived quantities. Example, velocity, acceleration, force. Velocity can be expressed as velocity is equal to displacement by time. Velocity can be expressed as displacement by time. So now we are expressing the velocity in terms of the base quantities displacement and time. Similarly, you can express the quantities in terms of the fundamental quantities. Those quantities are called derived quantities. Except the base quantities, all the physical quantities can be expressed in terms of the base quantities. Now we can see an important point, that is plane angle and solid angle. Plane angle and solid angle are also derived quantities. Previously they are supplementary quantities, now they are no longer supplementary quantities. They are also derived quantities. Plane angle is expressed as arc by radius, whereas solid angle is expressed as surface area by radius square. இப்போ இந்த ரெண்டு டாபிக்கும் ரீகால் பண்ணலாம். Definition of physical quantity, types of physical quantities. Physical quantities are the quantities that can be measured and in terms of which laws of physics are described. The quantities that can be measured and laws of physics are described are called physical quantities. Types of physical quantities are two types. What are the two types of physical quantities? அப்படின்னா two types of physical quantities are fundamental quantities and derived quantities. Fundamental quantities cannot be expressed in terms of other physical quantities. Derived quantities can be expressed in terms of the base quantities. 7 fundamental quantities are there. and all the except the 7 base quantities, all the remaining quantities are derived quantities. They can be derived in terms of the fundamental quantities.